Hey there, welcome to Starting Line Church. My name is Al, and I'm one of the pastors here, and we are really glad that you have joined us today. This week, we're continuing our series called A Doubter's Guide to Jesus, where we're going to be exploring 7 different characteristics of Jesus so we can understand who he is on a more deeper level. Because we found out that while we like to put Jesus in a box, we can't do it because there's so much to him. There's so much that makes up who he is. So far in this series, we've talked about Jesus as teacher and Jesus as healer. But today, we're going to take a little turn that you might not expect, that might not be as common to you, but it is equally important. Jesus as Israel. And to understand what we're talking about today, we have to go back all the way to the beginning, years and years before Jesus walked this earth. So to do that, I want to begin by telling you a story. So sit back, relax, and just kind of take it in as I tell you about it. It's a story that begins somewhere between 2000 and 1800 BC. With a man named Abraham. Abraham was called by God to lead a brand new nation, one that would be blessed by God and would bring blessing to all the other nations to come. And within a few generations, Abraham's descendants had grown into a sizable group of people, 12 different tribes, which collectively became known as the nation of Israel. Unfortunately, for these guys, the next few hundred years were not spent in the land that God promised them, but in Egypt, where they were in slavery under Pharaoh. However, out of God's grace and mercy, he got his people out of slavery hundreds of years later by using a man named Moses to help lead the Israelites out of Egypt. Well, after this exodus, God called Moses up to a mountain, or he received the instruction that God was giving to his people. These important things that God was saying, these are the things you need to follow to love me and others well. And they were known as the 10 Commandments. But even after these laws that God gave to the people, the nation of Israel, they agreed to kind of just live however they wanted to live, not following what God asked of them. And this all took place in the desert over a 40-year period, which is known as their time of wandering in the wilderness. Now, even though they made it to the promised land, eventually, along the way, they participated in many different sins that God was not pleased with. And it was not an easy road to get to their destination. Like we said, they eventually got there. But once they got there was even more disobedience that took place from the Israelites. And there was something more that they were looking for and searching for, that God was not enough. There was restoration and help and healing coming. And that's where we pick up in our story today. Now you might be thinking, what in the world did you tell me that story for? What in the world does that have to do with Jesus? And why did you go through that long thing? Because the history of Israel, that story, that summary, sets the scene as the portrait of Jesus as Israel, specifically himself as the new Israel. It sets the scene for why Jesus did what he did while he was on earth. And if you're listening and if you're unsure about this Jesus thing, it gives us a little more evidence of the truth of it all. Throughout the life of Jesus, God portrays him in this light so intentionally and so specifically with him as Israel. And today, we're going to look at those examples by comparing moments in Jesus' life to moments back in the lives of the Israelites. And as we lean in together today, I think you're going to find it all pretty cool and pretty relevant for your life today. First thing we're going to break down, Jesus as Israel out of Egypt. Like I mentioned earlier in this story, the Israelites, they were in slavery in Egypt for hundreds of years until God finally gets them out. And throughout the Bible, many people wrote about this event. But in one particular writing, there's a prophet named Hosea who's lamenting the fact that although God had rescued Israel from Egypt in these miraculous ways, they still didn't follow the ways of God. They still continued to turn away from him. And so he's upset about this. And he writes this: "Out of Egypt I called my son. But the more they were called, the more they went away from me." This is describing the Israelites and their sin. And what's interesting about this statement made in the Old Testament is that we find it again by a totally different author years later in Matthew chapter 2. If you want to turn there, you can. It'll be on the screen if you don't want to. In this passage, Jesus was recently born into the world, and the Lord appeared to Joseph, his father, in a dream, telling them that they needed to flee. They needed to leave where they were because King Herod wanted to kill Jesus. It was an urgent command, so they did it right away, and they left where they were at. Matthew chapter 2, 14 through 15 says this: "That night, Joseph left for Egypt with the child and Mary, his mother, and they stayed there until Herod's death. This fulfilled what the Lord had spoken through the prophet: 'I called my son out of Egypt.'" Jumping down to verse 19. "When Herod died, an angel of the Lord appeared in a dream to Joseph in Egypt. 'Get up,' the angel said, 'take the child and his mother back to the land of Israel, because those who were trying to kill the child are now dead.' So Joseph got up and returned to the land of Israel with Jesus and his mother." Here we see that God is hiding Jesus away in Egypt to avoid Herod from killing him, and then calls him back from Egypt once Herod is dead. Verse 15 says, "I called my son out of Egypt." If you remember, this is the same phrase that the prophet says about the nation of Israel thousands of years ago. So what's striking is that the infant Jesus' return from Egypt back to the land of Israel is actually the fulfillment of God, of how he formerly rescued the Israelites from Egypt back in the day, long ago. The word fulfillment refers to being filled up or bringing light to what previously was in the dark. So Matthew is showing us that Jesus is the true Israelite. He will live his life perfectly and without sin. And so Mary and Joseph and Jesus, they're going to Egypt and then they're escaping back to Israel. This is a beautiful picture that Jesus is the true and faithful Israel. And reminds us that God is our everlasting rescuer in times of trouble. So Jesus as Israel out of Egypt. Second one, Jesus as Israel in the desert. Our second passage today is going to be in Matthew 4. So just 2 chapters over from where you were. Matthew 4, 1 through 11. And in this, we're going to see Jesus in the desert with the devil. Before Jesus embarked on his public career as a teacher and a healer, before he started his ministry that lasted about 3 years, and led to his point of his death and resurrection, he underwent a grueling 40-day wandering through the deserts of Israel. Into the desert he goes. Nothing grows there. It doesn't rain. It's not hospitable. It's not good to live there. And what's striking is that Jesus, he chose to wander the wilderness for 40 days, and the temptations he faced there resemble the trials faced by Israel in their desert wandering for 40 years. Let's read this together. Matthew 4, 1 through 11. "Then Jesus was led by the Spirit into the wilderness to be tempted by the devil. After fasting 40 days and 40 nights, he was hungry. The tempter came to him and said, 'If you are the Son of God, tell these stones to become bread.' Jesus answered, 'It is written, man shall not live on bread alone, but on every word that comes from the mouth of God.' Then the devil took him to the holy city and had him stand on the highest point of the temple. If you are the Son of God, he said, throw yourself down, for it is written, he will command his angels concerning you, and they will lift you up in their hands so that you will not strike your foot against a stone. Jesus answered him, it is also written, do not put the Lord your God to the test. Again, the devil took him to a very high mountain and showed him all the kingdoms of the world and their splendor. All this I will give you, he said, if you will bow down and worship me. Jesus said to him, away from me, Satan, for it is written, worship the Lord your God and serve him only. Then the devil left him, and angels came and attended him. Jesus' 40-day desert trial appears to recall and almost reenact Israel's 40-year desert trial 1,000 years prior to this moment in the life of Jesus. There's a clear comparison between the sins that Israel committed in the wilderness and the things that Satan was tempting Jesus with in the desert. Let's look at it for a second. One of them concerned food. When the Israelites were in the wilderness, the nation got sick and tired of eating what's called manna. It's kind of like a bread. And so they complained and arrogantly demanded something better, something more interesting for them to eat. We see the complete opposite reaction with Jesus in this passage that we just read. Jesus was hungry. He was starving. He was weak after not eating for 40 days. I don't know about you people, but if I skip a meal, I am dying. Like it does not work. I can't fathom not eating for 40 days. But even in these circumstances, Jesus, he didn't use his divine power to turn the stones into bread like Satan was tempting him to do. Instead, he waited on God to provide for his needs. The second one we see is their second sin in the desert was putting the Lord to the test. At the slightest setback that they faced, they demanded that God proved himself to them all over again. Even though they were just delivered from Egypt in slavery, that was still in their recent memory. We don't see this with Jesus in our passage. When he was urged by the devil to throw himself off the high mountain to test God's faithfulness, he says to him, do not put the Lord your God to the test. The third of Israel's failures was worshiping other gods and idols and desires that were not God himself. And when Satan tempts Jesus of the same thing, he doesn't give in. These moments for Israel were the beginning of the end for the nation. But Jesus submitting himself to a 40-day trial in the desert, which would withstand all the temptations that ruined Israel, Jesus was enacting a powerful message that in Christ, our story can be rewritten and we can have a new beginning. It can look different. Our past is our past, but we can look different with our future. Number 3. Jesus as Israel, as the 12 new tribes. In the history of Israel, the number 12 had unique significance. Specifically here in what we were talking about at the beginning, it was the number of sons born to Abraham's grandson named Jacob, which meant that it was the number of tribes in the chosen nation of Israel. We see that number 12 come up a lot in Scripture, specifically again with Jesus. The last passage we're going to be in today is from Mark chapter 3. Mark chapter 3, verses 13 through 19. And to give you some context, it's here that Jesus is calling the first disciples, the first small group of people to follow the life and ways of him before it was a common practice among many people. Mark chapter 3, verses 13 through 19 says this. Afterward, Jesus went up on a mountain and called out the ones he wanted to go with him. And they came to him. Then he appointed 12 of them and called them his apostles. They were to accompany him, and he would send them out to preach, giving them authority to cast out demons. These are the 12 he chose. Simon, whom he named Peter, James and John, the sons of Zebedee, but Jesus nicknamed them sons of thunder, Andrew, Philip, Bartholomew, Matthew, Thomas, James, Thaddeus, Simon, Judas Iscariot, the one who later betrayed him. 12 guys. It's not an accident that Jesus selected and sent out exactly 12 people to continue the work of his ministry. Jesus' choice of this number provides an important clue to his intentions. That these 12 men were chosen by Jesus as the true and restored 12 tribes of Israel that he came to establish and fulfill. In this moment, he's declaring that he alone will bring the promise of salvation, and that it is not just for Israel, it's not just for Jewish people, but for the entire world. I think what all this reminds us of is that God is not bound by time or space. Because thousands of years after these events happened, back in the Old Testament, before Jesus walked the earth, God fulfills these same things through Jesus himself. The coming of Jesus into the world wasn't just some random thing that happened. He wasn't just some wise guy that taught people and healed people. The coming of Jesus is deeply historical. The coming of Jesus was about God's love for his people and wanting to save them and establish and fulfill the problems before. And how he did that was by hitting the undo button on everything that happened prior with the Israelites. So this is cool, right? We see this, like maybe we've never learned this before, and this is pretty cool, that Jesus fulfills Israel. But what does it mean for our lives? Why is this all so important? What does it mean to us? If you remember anything from this sermon, remember this. The reality is, just like the Israelites, we fall short of what God calls us to do and who God calls us to be. Every day. But the good news is that Jesus' fully obedient life more than makes up for our frequently disobedient lives. We see in these examples that he redeems and restores the broken. And our standing before God one day in heaven is dependent on a response to Jesus' obedience, not just based on ourselves. So what this means is that we view the Christian life based on what Jesus did on the cross, how we figure out how to be like him in the process. How are you becoming like Jesus? How are you trying to copy Jesus' story into your own life story? Have you responded to the grace that he gives us, acknowledging his perfection in your imperfection? Think back on all these stories we talked about today. Like Jesus, we listen to God when he tells us to move and to go. Like Jesus, we try to resist the temptation to grumble at God. Like Christ, like Jesus, we say no to putting God to the test by demanding signs of him and insisting that he do things our way and insist instead of just trust his ways. Like Jesus, we refuse to bow down to the gods of our age and the idols that distract us. The author of A Doubter's Guide to Jesus, John Dickson, the book that this series is based on, says this at the end of the chapter. As the new Israel, Jesus represents his people before God. As the new Israel, Jesus models what it means to live as the people of God. The Christian life is lived out within these twin realities of what Jesus did on our behalf and what he showed us to do in our life.